this first lecture meeting of the BCA year. I was advised, in my inauguration, that I should be invoking two lords as the first agenda for my year. The first was to have Satyanarayana Puja, and the second was Pinakin Bhai's lecture. These are the two lords we worship, and with whose name. But as I was telling Pinakin Bhai, that we had a little quandary in the last few years. We had both the lords being worshipped on the same day, and surprisingly, the Lord Pinakin Desai had a larger audience because they would miss that prayer and they'd come for this meeting. So we changed the dates last year, and thanks to that, we had some larger attendance yesterday at the puja than what we had every year. The topic for today is on transfer pricing. Effective financial year 2001-2, the Finance Minister introduced detailed transfer pricing provisions in the Indian income tax regime. The provisions were brought in to prevent the planning of transactions between two related parties, which could result in erosion of India's tax base for transferring of profits or income outside India. The provisions laid out various methods for determining the arm's length price of a transfer of a transaction between two related parties. They also brought into checks balances in the form of audits, annual audits and assessments. The simple idea was to ensure that the transaction between two known parties is done at a price which would have been done by parties otherwise if they were not related or known to each other. These provisions were brought in only for cases where at least one of the parties to the transaction is a non-resident. Now the Finance Act 2012 has extended the scope of the transfer pricing provisions to cover certain transactions between the domestic related prices. The domestic transfer pricing provisions are effective from financial year 2012-13, while the underlying principles and methods for determining the arm's length price for domestic price transactions are the same as for the international transactions. Challenges arise in determining what constitutes a domestic related party. One may also face difficulties in working out the ALP for certain types of domestic transactions, salary payments to the managing director being one example. In a scenario like today, when the investor confidence is extremely low on account of various other factors like political instability or policy paralyzation, uncertain environment, one of the key factors is the cases the likes of Vodafone and the Shell. A lot of confusion surrounds transfer pricing in India. Mr. Pinakin Desai has been kind enough to accept our invitation to help clear some of the haze around the domestic transfer pricing provisions. Mr. Pinakin Desai, as I have introduced Lord Pinakin Desai earlier, needs no introduction. And when people say that, they actually go about introducing Pinakin Desai. I intend to do that. I don't intend to do that. I'm going to just say that he needs no introduction. And I think we must welcome him with a loud applause. For the handful of you who do not know Mr. Pinakin Desai, I'll do that separately. Thank you.
Good evening. The President, sir, the other dignitaries on the dais, missing for the time being, of course, and I am elated to have with us Sri Arvind Bhai, Sri K.C. Naran, and our famed personality, Mr. Manoharan as well. I'm happy to be once again here for this inaugural session and thankful in particular to all that Naushad mentioned. My only caution to him is that being a human being, sometimes I start believing what he says and would be quite obliged in case he were to guide me on the right path. We have for today, for the discussion, a provision which has been introduced quite recently, and it will come up for implementation in a few months' time. For those who are familiar with international transfer pricing, they would believe that these provisions do not have anything different in particular, particularly because as part of tax audit report, some of the parameters, some of the clauses were being reported on an informal basis. For example, as an auditor, I was required to take a view as to whether any payment has been made to a related person covered by section 40, capital A, subsection 2, as to whether an undertaking qualifies for deduction, as to whether there was any transfer of goods or services between two undertakings, both of which either may be eligible to tax holiday or one of them may be eligible, the other may not be eligible. On a subjective basis, therefore, a call was already being taken. And what is now required is that you need to be little more methodical, and it will add to the documentation burden, verification of the document. If you believe you were always good, you will now have to prove annually that you continue to be good and that you are good, and somebody will evaluate your belief based on documentation. It may at times happen that on account of documentation, things may become little more monotonous what they were, little more challenging maybe in the initial period, but maybe to be regularly followed in the years that follow. And my therefore request to all my young friends who may not have had an opportunity to get an access to international transfer pricing would be that there is nothing something magical, nothing something great which one should be afraid of. When tax audit was introduced, we had the same concern. When maybe Schedule 6, Mahokaro, etc. were introduced, we had the same concern. So whenever there is a new product or an animal which is introduced, there is some temporary concern which one would have. It is nothing but fear of the unknown for the time being, but one will get used to what is happening around, and I am sure BCA will have many more programs which will equip all those who have not had an opportunity to swim into this water. With that introduction, let's work on what is the genesis of all these provisions. In Glaxo's case, Supreme Court was concerned with a scenario where there were two core subsidiaries which were operating between themselves. There were certain transfers or transactions between the two of them, and ironically, both the companies were paying proper tax. In other words, even if there was a dispute as to whether there was an overcharge or an undercharge, the tax collected by the revenue was equal because there was a complete tax neutrality between the two parties who were operating. Supreme Court also came to the conclusion that as per the definition of a related concern as it then was, the two subsidiaries with a common parent will not constitute associated enterprises. In a way, Supreme Court could have left it at that, and a suggestion could have been that if this relationship is considered to be sensitive, then section 40 capital A2 may be amended and may be widened to include this relationship. But the court went a step further, and the court mentioned that there are certain provisions in the Act, and what the court had in mind was section 40A2 and tax holiday provisions, and the court observes that there is a plausibility that some person, some taxpayers who are bent on saving tax might play on the prices in a manner that one person may be able to pay lesser tax compared to what he would have paid on a totality if the transactions were carried out in a manner where the pricing is arm's length or pricing is not motivated by tax saving. It was in deference to this that the court mentioned government should act and government should introduce the provisions. Why did the court say this? Court said that in certain situations the officer is called upon to determine the fair market value of goods or services or facilities, and the officer may not have wherewithal to work out the fair market value. In order that the taxpayers are not left to the vagaries of uncertainty which may arise because of the subjective standards which the officers may follow, meant as a measure of convenience to the taxpayer, it was mentioned that we should have these provisions. And the revenue picked it up from there. We have now what we may call domestic transfer pricing provisions. It may be to a large extent new wine in the old bottle, and as we refer to the illustrations we will find as to what these provisions will mean for we the chartered accountants in practice and for those of us who might be serving the industry. So we have dealt with the object. The object is that if there is a tendency to make excessive payment to an associate concern, excessive compared to the needs of business, excessive compared to the correct pricing, then in that case such a tendency must be discouraged. Second tendency is that if there is a tax holiday unit and the affairs are being arranged in such a way that greater income is earned within a tax holiday unit, thereby there is a saving of tax, avoidance of tax, then in that case such a tendency must also be discouraged. And while specifying this, as is customary, power has been reserved that as of today we are stating this, but come tomorrow it is very likely that we might expand the scope and suggest something more drastic, something more liberal, something more tighter. Now what is the new concept which probably we had not heard of if we were not doing international transfer pricing formally, is the concept of arm's length price. Market value concept we were always aware. What is now introduced is the concept of arm's length price. Arm's length means that what is an amount which on an average a willing person would have paid to another. So if we refer to the analysis over a period, and if we examine the annual average of the behavior of two parties which were interacting with each other on an arm's length basis, that is from at a distance. Arm's length will mean that you are keeping a distance. With non-associate, with unknown people, you will keep a certain distance, and that is how the coining of a price on an arm's length. Market value means, as of today, am I paying the right price? Arm's length, the way it is going to be implemented may mean that what they will arrive at will be a price which one gets on the basis of an average behavior, and if you would like to show or if you would like to establish that you had to deviate from that average, which average happens to be a herd analysis, if you want to deviate from the average, what are the adjustments which you would propose? Why would you believe that you were justified in deviating from the average? So the burden of establishing deviation from the manner in which the arm's length price is going to be determined will now be shifting to the documentation which will need to be prepared by the taxpayer, and the documentation based on which the tax auditor will have to take a view. So if on a rainy day, if a cabby were to charge 500 rupees for what would have been only say 50 to 100 rupees, well, that might be considered to be a market rate. But on an arm's length basis, one would be tempted to say that look, there are fixed meter charges which are available, and why did you ever have to pay 500 rupees in order to make a travel? Then based on your documentation, you will be required to show that it was considered to be necessary and a proper adjustment ought to be made on account of the factors which were exceptional. ALP linked computation. Section 92, subsection 2, capital A. And what does it say? That section was already existing. Only a small modification has been made. It now reads, any allowance for an expenditure or allowance for interest or allocation of cost or expense or any income in relation to the specified domestic transaction shall be computed having regard to the arm's length price. Mark the words added are specified domestic transaction. The rest of the section was operative in relation to international transaction anyway. On account of this, you will find, and there is likely to be some difficulty on the field, though I don't see any difficulty which should arise, that the section says income in relation to a transaction will also be computed as per ALP. In international regime, we are aware that ALP concept works both ways. A person who is earning income ought to earn the correct income. If he is earning lesser than what may be considered to be on an average or on an arm's length the correct income which he ought to charge, then in that case there could be notional addition which can be made to income. But when we come to the specified domestic transaction, for the time being we will find that the considerations and consequences are different. Question therefore arises that if the section does say that income in relation to specified domestic transaction should also be at ALP. Why am I saying that? There may not be any difficulty with regard to the income component. The reason is, section is qualified by the words in relation to specified domestic transaction. Therefore, we need to go over, which we will do in the next slide, to what is the definition of specified domestic transaction. The way the definition is worded, we find that the income component is not covered, and therefore, despite section 92, subsection 2A, for the time being, the income component is not likely to trouble us. There will be one exception, but when we come to the inter-transfer unit divisions, which are tax holiday regime units or divisions of the very same taxpayer, there could be some exception and the word income might become relevant, but maybe we will deal with that appropriately when we come to that slide. We find reference here to cost allocation. This doesn't mean that cost allocation in itself is always to be regarded as SDT, specified domestic transaction. Again, when we go back to the definition of SDT, this point might become clear. Now, what happens if my transaction is not at ALP? It means that my expenditure and consequentially my chargeable income will be adjusted. But unfair that the law normally on transfer pricing always is, we are told that this will be a single track adjustment. If the revenue authority finds that as a result of STT and ALP mismatch, income is lower than what it should have been, then it can be jacked up, but it cannot be brought down. So if I have erred in favor of the tax revenue and declared a higher income, on account of the ALP adjustment, my income cannot come down. Secondly, there cannot be an internal set-off between two transactions. So if I have made one purchase in the month of January, which is at a price higher than ALP, I have made another purchase in February, which is at a price lower than ALP, then it is not as if that I need to compare the totality of transaction, the totality of pricing, average price which I have paid, and then compare it with the ALP. There cannot be a set-off of one against the other. And the third is that there is to be no correlative adjustment. So if I have transacted with my sister concern and there is a tax neutrality, if I paid lower tax, my sister concern might have paid higher tax. But if on account of transfer pricing, I am required to pay higher tax, there will not be any corresponding reduction which will be handed down to my sister concern. Now this brings us to the heart of what we will need to deal with. STT has been defined. The definition, first limb, there are 6 limbs, but you will find almost about 3 limbs might come to the same result, because if we have dealt with section 80 IA into bracket subsection 8 and 80 IA subsection 10, possibly all other limbs will get addressed. The first limb is that if there is any expenditure which is incurred in favor of a person who is referred to in section 48(2), then such an expenditure will be covered. as part of tax audit report, we are aware and we do find out the list of persons who are covered by section 48(2). But the important point to note is, what all that is covered is an expenditure and not income which accrues from out of a transaction with a related party. And it is when that provision is introduced that we will have something in the nature of a havoc which would be playing, something which is happening in case of international arena, and we will have the bitter test of it, and let's hope we are in a position to avoid the same. What it may mean thereafter would be that if you are a party related to BCA, BCA will be told that for every seminar you must charge something which is a fair price, go by the standards which are adopted not only by the other professional bodies but by your own parent body, the Institute of Chartered Accountants. And if you continue to charge something which is low, then BCA can be charged to tax in respect of the fees never collected by BCA, but still there will be an addition which will make to the income of BCA. But that is provided parties are related, and that is provided such a provision is introduced at a future date. Other links, what they are trying to say is that if I am a taxpayer, A Limited, if I have a tax holiday unit, supposing I either have a project which is undertaken in the nature of a hospital project, I am entitled to 100% tax holiday, or I am a power unit, or I am a manufacturing unit in a northeastern state or whatever, or SEZ, and let's suppose I am entitled to tax exemption. ATIA 10 is directing that if I have arranged the affairs of my business while dealing with my associate parties and while dealing with any party who can be regarded as closely connected or for any other reason, so that it is much wider, not limited to section 48(2) parties, but for any reason, if I have played some mischief and arranged my affairs in such a manner that I am earning more than ordinary profit which I deserve with a view to claiming higher tax holiday, then in such an event, while granting tax holiday to me, I will be granted tax holiday only with regard to the ordinary profit, and the balance profit will be subjected to tax. That is section 80IA subsection 10. Another is section 80IA subsection 8. There we are told that one entity is not transacting with another entity, but the very same entity has two divisions or two different undertakings. One of them is an eligible undertaking, other one is not eligible or could be eligible. Question arises when there are intra-division transactions with the SSC remaining the very same entity. Clinically, therefore, it is not a transaction because there are no two persons involved, but it is deemed to be a transaction. So, transfer of goods or services between two divisions of the same taxpayer will also be judged as to whether these transfers have taken place at the correct values or they have not taken place at the correct values. On a sum and substance, these are the only three which have been introduced. The rest all is in the nature of a consequential provision. For example, in section 80IC, we are told that the provisions of section 80IA 8 and 80IA 10 will be considered to have been incorporated also as part of section 80IC. In order to cover such a provision, consequential amendments have been made, but in substance there are only three categories of transactions. One, expenditure in favor of 48 party. Second, one entity which is a tax holiday entity dealing with another legal entity, and the affairs are arranged in such a manner that more than ordinary profit is earned by a tax holiday entity. And the third is, there are two divisions of the very same legal entity, and there are internal transfer but limited only to goods and services between these two divisions of the very same taxpayer. And the other condition is that the aggregate of all the transactions entered into in the previous year exceeds rupees 5 crore. If the totality does not exceed 5 crore, the taxpayer does not have any obligation of maintaining documentation. He did not procure a specific report. The assessing officer will not have power thereafter to subject any transaction, forward that to the transfer pricing officer, which will be a specialized cell. But the power of the assessing officer to apply normal provisions of the law as were always in existence will still continue. So, if I am relieved of the documentation requirement, if I am relieved of the audit report requirement, it will not mean that section 80IA 8 or 80IA 10 or 48(2) will not apply to me. What all that will happen will be that all these transactions will continue to be navigated and captured as per the law which was always available prior to introduction of this provision. It is another thing that the officer will say that, look, even under the old provision, I had to determine the market value. How do I determine the market value? And he will say that why do I not look at the arm's length price determined by a party who is similarly placed, and he will now say that ALP which is being determined in the case of another taxpayer can also be considered to be a yardstick of the market value, and I therefore adopt that market value. That I would believe is a consequence of the provisions which have been applied, but that is not the same thing as saying that I will be subjected to penalty or a transfer pricing audit. 5 crore limit for a transaction entered into, and question will arise, what is a transaction entered into? If I already entered into, supposing a rental transaction for a property 7 years back, and I have been paying the same rent, then in calculating the limit, can I say that I have not entered into any transaction in the current year? I would believe that if my holding on to the tenancy is dependent on my making payment, then payment which is being made by me in the current year in itself also constitutes a transaction, but with reference to the rental payment which I am required to make in the current year. I don't possibly require a fresh license in order to say that this is a different transaction. The threshold of 5 crore is required to be written on the basis of entries in the books of account, and this is clear also from Form 3CEB, which has now been prescribed. There will be relief from documentation and ALP benchmarking if the value is below 5 crore. Now the illustration will therefore show that it is possible that even if my values may not be accurate, I may not have the requirement of compliance, because as per books of account my turnover was 4.50, whereas on a scientific basis the ALP might still work out to 5.25, but that still will mean that I did not have any obligation of reporting. However, if supposing I had 5 transactions to be considered, there was another 6 transaction which I missed out. I am calculating 4.50 crore based on 5 transactions and missing out the 6th transaction, then it is case of a clear default, and then I would believe that I could be required on a show cause notice to comply with the provisions, and the penal provisions may also apply. But having taken into account all the transactions, merely because there is a value mismatch, it will not add any burden to any obligation on me to get into the compliance of the provision. Now as we go along, we will find quite a few areas where there is a probable second view which is possible. My suggestion therefore to my client would be that as between two views, something which is conservative is better to be followed. And let me make it clear that while we are technically discussing it, I think it will be left to the discretion of an individual at the time of implementation as to whether the taxpayer may or may not get into a possible litigation area. In any case, even if one is taking a view that something has not been reported, it would always be eminently very desirable to make a proper disclosure that the ground on which you have not taken a particular transaction into account is motivated by reasoning ABC and or by an opinion of a professional and or it is a view which has been canvassed by the institute or BCA or whatever. Now an interesting question that arises is that when there are intra-division transfer of goods or services, say there is a power unit and there is a manufacturing unit, and both of them, let's assume, happen to be tax holiday unit. One could be 100%, another could be 30%. If there is a transfer of goods, namely say power, from one unit to the other, and the value is say 1 crore. Now insofar as manufacturing unit is concerned, it is again a transaction, because on a transfer there are two divisions involved. So while calculating the limit of 5 crore, do I take the value to be 1 crore or do I multiply and take the value to be 2 crore? I would personally believe that there is no need for aggregating the two. There is only one transfer and the value of that transfer as per books of account is 1 crore. Another point to be noted is that while reckoning 5 crore of rupees and for determining whether I have an obligation to report or not, I am not getting into an exercise of whether the transaction is ALP compliant or not. I am merely counting the transactions. I am merely identifying the transaction, and if the value exceeds 5 crore of rupees, it is thereafter that I have to get into documentation and ALP determination exercise. For reckoning therefore 5 crore limit, howsoever adequate your pricing may be, howsoever methodical your pricing may be, you will still be governed by an arithmetic quantification and not any subjective exercise. Now let's take an example, because it might so happen on account of the definition that some items which we may not readily believe might also come up for the purpose of reckoning the turnover. Let's assume that LIC happens to be a 20% PE investor in two different companies. Now by virtue of that, what will happen is that the two companies, who might be wholly unrelated to each other, but by virtue of a common shareholder, and now the definition says common shareholder with 20% or more of voting power, the two entities will become sort of related parties for the purpose of reporting. Group insurance payment, therefore, which is paid by one of the companies to LIC will come up for reporting. It might be at a price which is market driven, but for determining 5 crore of the limit, you will not have to consider or get into the ALC compliance exercise. If an expenditure is of a disallowable nature, say remuneration paid to a partner, or something in the nature of a fine or penalty, then you do not have the damages which are paid to the other party, and that is on account of a statutory default or whatever, and you therefore take a view that expenditure is not allowable. Such an amount, even if paid to an associate, will not be taken into account. But supposing you have an expenditure where you find that you paid 2 crores of rupees, out of which 50 lakhs of rupees is likely to be considered as in the nature of 48 expenditure, because you perceive that to be an extra amount which has been paid to a related party, or you have deducted tax at source only with reference to a smaller amount, the allowability therefore is likely to be smaller compared to the expenditure which you have incurred. In such an event, for reckoning once again 5 crore limit, the gross expenditure is to be taken into account, but for the purpose of determination of ALP, some different standard may apply, which we will probably look at when we come to the other slides. A transaction which is international transaction is not a domestic transaction. But there could be some cases, all cases though it may be, you may find that a transaction which is with a non-resident could also be a specified domestic transaction. For example, for the domestic TP, director is considered to be a related person. We do not find that so far as international TP is concerned. Any payment which is made to a non-resident director is therefore likely to be a domestic transaction, though the other party may still be a non-resident, and it is not therefore required that the transaction must be wholly with two residents. So these are some situations here where other party is a non-resident and still you will find that the transaction is covered by domestic TP. The best case you can take is that more than 26% holding takes you to international tax. But if another company is holding, though a non-resident or a foreign company, more than 20%, then it is covered by domestic. So between 20 to 26%, it is the domestic TP which will apply. About 26%, it is the international TP which will apply. A part of domestic, only an expenditure limit will be attracted, but a part of international arena, then in that case you may find that the income component may also be troubled. No notional computation of income. We discussed this with reference to the BCA's example, and you will find quite a few day-to-day life examples here. Grant of interest-free loan to an associate, corporate guarantee and no amount charged, sale of goods at less than fair market value, allowing use of trademark, know-how, common service without any charge to an associate, gratis lease of machinery to associate. In all such cases you will find that income is lower than what it is, but still there won't be domestic transfer pricing compliance needed. Obviously, if I am recovering lesser than what I ought to, then for the payer you will find that there is likely to be no adjustment because his expenditure is also lower than what it would have been a permissible expenditure. Now you may have certain tax holiday units where option is given to select the years. I would personally believe that in relation to tax holiday unit transfers or transaction, only the option years are required to be counted. If an option is not exercised, if you have opted out, then during those years, the unit may not for this purpose be considered to be a tax holiday unit. But once an option is exercised, merely because loss may have been incurred in one of the years, it may not be a ground for us to resist the applicability of domestic transfer pricing provision. There are certain entities where you may find that the income is exempt from tax. A company is supposing earning agricultural income. In such a case, do you need a compliance? I would believe that compliance may not be needed, having regard to the object, but we'll have to wait for what the institute has to say. In the old days for tax audit, the view expressed was that if the entity itself is exempt, then routine compliances, which can either way not have any impact on chargeable income, they should be considered to be academic. However, if a company has only one source of income, and that is the SEZ, where 100% of the income is earned, can we say that I am on the same footing as a person who is earning agricultural income? I would probably believe that this may not be so. The reason is that if I am earning more than ordinary income as part of SEZ, it is likely that I may lose the exemption. Therefore, the transactions of SEZ are required to be tested. If I have overpaid an expenditure, then in that case, if ALP is determined and if my income is increased in relation to the adjusted amount, I am not entitled to claim the exemption. So, philosophy of transfer pricing, which can trouble the SEZ, would be that if you are otherwise compliant, you will be granted tax holiday, but if you want to claim tax holiday, you must avoid an adjustment to transfer pricing values. Any increase in income as a result of transfer pricing adjustment, and if that adjustment is made by the assessing officer, then with regard to that enhanced income, as if short of a punishment, you will not be able to claim the incentive deduction. That would be unlike in case of agricultural income. Even if there is a change, there is no authority which has been given to the tax authority to deny to me exemption in relation to the enhanced agricultural income. It is only with regard to the incentive provision that such a power has been taken by the statute. If there is expenditure of 2 lakhs and ALP is determined at 1.5 lakhs, there is a default in tax withholding. How do I look at the provision? I would believe that section 48(2) will be given precedence. Something which is above the ALP will be disallowed in toto. Even if I had complied with TDS, it would have been disallowed. But with regard to 1.5 lakhs, there will be ALP calculation which is already made. In the current year, you will find that transfer pricing provision applied, ALP determined, and as and when TDS is paid at a future date, 1.5 lakhs will be considered to be an admissible deduction. Now let's look at scope of section 48(2). Domestic TP applies to persons who are covered by 48(2). The list in 48(2) is not the same as we have for accounting purpose in AS 18. We therefore need to be careful that we draw a list of parties covered by 48(2) instead of relying on the definition or concept of AS 18. 48(2) meant to be covered for transaction entered into in financial year 12-13 as the precedent stated. So if there is a past transaction, outstanding credit balance which is paid in the current year, then in that case we do not have to benchmark that transaction. Allowance for that has been perfected in an earlier period. Even if some amount has been disallowed in a past year, but which is being granted as a deduction in the current year as a result of TDS compliance, I would not believe that you need to benchmark that transaction, because even there, subject to the contingency of TDS payment, the deduction has already been perfected in an earlier year. Payment to a related party which should result in an expenditure. Payment of dividend, therefore, to a related party is not to be covered. It is not an expenditure. Payment of loan or share capital is also not to be regarded as an expenditure. Payment should be a payment to an independent party. Therefore, while on the limb of section 48(2), we are concerned with two different entities operating with each other and never with an intra-unit transfer. Now, what is the history behind section 48(2), and will that history have any bearing on the interpretation that we take? We are told in section 48(2), subsection 1, that an expenditure can be disallowed if we find that there is something unreasonable having regard to FMV, or legitimate need or benefit which is derived by the taxpayer. There are three different links involved. I may make higher payment, but that may be justified by my legitimate needs. It may be the fair market value as on that date. But a converse also can apply, that if I am having a small shop where I require only 100 square feet of the area, if I take on business account a property which is worth 100,000 square feet, I may pay a proper rent, but the officer may still say that we are paying ALP, I will still disallow because the rent expenditure is not the legitimate need of business, it is not a benefit which has been derived by the business of the taxpayer. But there are certain subjective considerations which one had to apply. And in a circular we were told that if there is a tax neutrality, then in that case don't apply the section, don't get into disallowance of any expenditure. Now what is likely to be the interrelationship between the two? Is 48.2a still relevant for me to be examined first before I get into 48.2b? Or am I now told that what all that you now have to consider is a blind exercise? Have you made any payment to a related person covered by 48.2b? If you have made a payment to a related party, then the officer will say, I don't want to argue as to what would have happened in the past year if you had made such a payment. Then you could have argued on 48.2a, but now 48.2a, that is all these subjective considerations, are of no relevance, because for transfer pricing regime, I am not interested in this. I am only interested in clause B, which is defining the list of related persons. While some persuasive arguments can be offered that there is an interrelationship between the two, the way the provision is drafted, a better view seems to be that for compliance with transfer pricing, we are merely concerned with the list of related persons. So once a payment has been made, then even if that payment can be justified by FMV, can be justified by legitimate needs, can be justified by benefit derived, still I am afraid it will come up for benchmarking and reporting. The language when we come to section 80IA 10 is little different, and we will come to that. Illustrative list, but we are aware we need hardly get into this. Now this is a typical scenario, therefore we find that here is a structure where we find that ACO is related to EXCO, EXCO is related to BCO, ACO and BCO are also interrelated, and all the transactions in any combination will therefore come up for aggregation of 5 crore, will come up for benchmarking, will come up for reporting and the like. Now this is a bone of contention, and I believe the institute is probably rethinking to change its stance, but we'll have to wait for a formal announcement. Question is that when there is a layer structure, whether ACO, the ultimate parent company, can be considered to be related to YCO in terms of section 40 capital A subsection 2. If one takes into account holding through the intermediate or an indirect holding, then the two of them will become related. For international transfer pricing, the language is that when there is a holding through the intermediary or indirectly, the parties become interrelated. But when we come to the domestic law, all that we are told is one party must be the beneficial owner of shares of the other. Now, who holds the shares of WIPO? I would believe shares of WIPO are held by EXCO, and merely because ECO can control EXCO does not mean that the ultimate parent company is the shareholder of WIPO. To my mind, therefore, applying the definition of beneficial owner that we have at the moment, we will find that ECO and WIPO may not be considered to be related parties, though for the purposes of AS 18 and also for transfer pricing, they might, in applicable situations, be regarded as related parties. One more angle when we come to 48.2, do I need to get into the aggregation of the shareholding or do I go by the individual shareholding? A Private Limited has 4 directors and each of them is holding 10% share in B Private Limited. If any one director was holding more than 20% in B Private Limited, the two parties would have been related. Here in fact 40% shares are held, but none of them individually exceeds 20%. So will the definition apply? And I would believe that the definition will not apply. It is fairly well settled that the beneficial ownership test is to be considered vis-a-vis each individual who is holding the shares. Now there are some controversies and we really do not have any answer today because a clinical result which one gets is different from what could be the intended result. A partner of the firm draws remuneration from the partnership firm. Is it required to be reported assuming that the partnership firm has other transactions where on an aggregate you find 5 crore of the turnover limit getting exceeded? Circular 636 of 1992 almost says that the partner remuneration is on a different footing and 48.2 should not apply. But instead of saying that, it says that it should be applied sparingly. There are judicial precedents to say that 48.2 cannot apply in a case where 40 small b is applicable. Also, just a minute. Also, you will find that ALP has nothing to do with allowable expenditure because even assuming that ALP is higher, but if the firm does not have assessable income, remuneration in any case is going to be disallowed. So the allowance is not based on ALP reckoning. There also is a provision which is a statutory provision. If there is any disallowance in the assessment of the firm, then in that case the partner cannot be charged. So statute needs a neutrality, whatever might be the ALP exercise that you carried out. I would therefore believe that there is a very strong case to suggest that partner remuneration is not to be benchmarked, but on a literal reading, on a conservative basis, until there is clarity, I think it would be better that a proper disclosure is made. Same also holds good with regard to a director. A director, how will you benchmark? Case for a director is a shade weaker than a case which we have for a partner, and a director even today is covered by 48(2). But there is going to be difficulty in benchmarking it. Some practical way will need to be found. Say for example, if I were to check up as to what a director is supposed to do, and if I were to take a view that a typical MBA will do the same work which this director is doing, or that I would have employed 3 different people in order to do what one director is doing, and if I make payment to all these parties who are unrelated, then in that case, I might be able to say that payment which is made is reasonable vis-a-vis a director. But our better view is that if under the company law administration an amount is a permissible amount, there should be a blanket statement that the transfer pricing provisions will not apply, because in some meaningful cases where we find that multiple crores of rupees are paid, you will have difficulty in benchmarking the transaction. Another controversy is, are you restricted only to the business aid, or will 48(2) get extended to income from other sources? And you will find that the reference of 48(2) is available also under the head income from other sources. Difficult to say that you can get out merely because you are covered by income from other source and not by the business aid. With regard to a depreciable asset, the capital asset, again a controversy. Try to be conservative. I would believe strong arguments can be advanced to say that a capital expenditure is not covered. Take for example, there are specific provisions which deal with regulating the cost of an asset if it is found to be excessive, section 43. So there is a separate statutory power. It should not be mixed up with the transfer pricing regulation. Again, assuming there is ALP, law is specific that you grant depreciation at stated rate with reference to the cost of acquisition, and there is nothing to suggest that the cost of acquisition can be altered. Again, capital asset is not an allowance for an expenditure. It is allowance for depreciation with reference to an expenditure. It is different from allowance for an expenditure. But our case will be quite ticklish and tricky, where the entirety of the asset purchased from a sister concern is coming up for 100% write-off in the year in which you purchased the asset. A better and a conservative view is to report the transaction. Now we have dealt with 80IA 10, that if one is earning more than ordinary profit, then the expenditure and the incentive can be regulated. Now look at the language here. A transaction which is referred to in section 80IA 10 means what? That one SEC is carrying on eligible or a tax holiday business, and it appears to the AO that due to close connection, the course of business with the other person is so arranged that more than ordinary profit is produced with a view to claiming higher deduction. So inbuilt in reference to 80IA 10 is that it is only if these conditions are fulfilled that a transaction will be covered by section 80IA 10. I would strongly believe that merely because there is a payment made to a related party, 80IA 10 is not automatically attracted, and only on that basis it may not be necessary for you to report the transaction. These are various incentives, but this is only the illustrative list where the difficulty can come. Now look at this. We have one company which is providing to BICO, which is a wholly owned subsidiary. Goods are sold at less than fair market value. Corporate guarantee is given by the parent company without charging guarantee. Know-how is granted for use without any cost. Resources can be used from HO without any price. Now, here as an auditor, I might be in a position to take a view that when there is an entity concept, is there a good ground why everything is being done free of cost? Our probable view is that the intention is to jack up the profit of the tax holiday unit. We need to be careful. Probably the transaction may need to be reported. ATIA 6 and ATIA 8, they refer to intra-unit transfer, but they are restricted in operation only to goods or services. And it may therefore happen that if the transfer is not of goods or services, the section may fail. Another caveat is that there is any other business in the other division. So both the divisions must be engaged in a business, only then the section will operate. Refer to the bullets there. Goods or services held for the purpose of eligible business are transferred to any other business, or goods or services held for the purpose of any other business are transferred to the eligible business. Let us therefore take an example that we have head office, and below the head office we have certain eligible and non-eligible units. HO is providing certain support and is incurring certain expenses which are corporate expenses. Now will it be required that all the services which are received by the eligible unit from HO, they ought to be reported and they should be benchmarked? I would believe it is not required. This is not a case where goods or services which are held by HO for the purpose of business of HO are being transferred to another unit. HO cannot be said to be in any independent business merely because it is providing support to the subsidiaries. Secondly, goods or services are not transferred. And third, when these sections were introduced, we were told by the explanatory memorandum that the intention is to cover only the marketable services of one unit to the another unit, the specialty function services, and not the regular routine or corporate services which are being undertaken by a parent company. Now what is the interplay? That if I were to return an income of 100 rupees in a power unit which is a tax holiday unit, and on the right hand side is a manufacturing unit that we find. Officer takes a view that a power unit which is charging 100 rupees to the manufacturing unit, in fact it should have charged 120 rupees to the manufacturing unit. So officer takes a view that I am charging lower than what I am actually charging at the moment. I could have claimed higher tax holiday if I had charged 120 rupees. If I had done it I would have been able to claim tax holiday of 120 rupees. But if I do not do it, adjustment is carried out by the officer, I will not be entitled to check up my tax holiday from 100 rupees to 120 rupees. Now, consequences of TP adjustment, and I think these are routine adjustment, and by and large it would mean that some of the penal provisions will be applicable. Now that brings us to a touchdown on what are the different methods of benchmarking. We will not get into the details because a detailed seminar, I am told, is coming up from BCA, where over the sessions these are going to be dealt with in detail, nor can they be explained with any satisfaction in a smaller lecture time. But we will still try to brush up on what we are trying to say. The philosophy is that each player is trying to justify the price which it is charging or the price which it is paying. And I think the only example that we can take on principles would be that supposing I and you are before our own client and we have to negotiate a price which I am supposed to charge to the client, and I am telling my client that you ought to pay me this amount, what am I going to tell my client? And what ultimately it will come down to in technical words will be determining what is known as a FAR analysis of the entity which is wanting to transact. I will have to bring on table to my client and say that what are the functions which I am carrying out for my client, which is a part of FAR, which are the assets which I am required to have or the resources which I am bringing on table for the client, and what is the risk element which is involved for me or for my client. So there is a relative bargaining which is taking place between a professional and a client. Unconsciously, while trying to justify to an adamant client what is the price which I am entitled to or which he ought to pay to me, what I am getting into is nothing but a FAR analysis which I will now be required to document and do on a contemporaneous basis. With regard to any transaction which is a tainted or affected transaction, I need to verify that if I am an arbitrator or an umpire and if I have to determine what belongs to the power unit and what belongs to the manufacturing unit, what would I have taken into consideration? What are the functions of power unit? What are the opportunities of power unit? What are the assets, the IPR, the resources, the intelligence, the technology which is being brought? What is the relative risk of a power failure of this particular technology as compared to what I am offering? Better the product, stronger the FAR analysis, greater is the price. Weaker the FAR analysis, the lower is the price. So on a bottom line, it is more of an economic function. It is more of a logical function. There are no bounds to originality, and one will have to take a fair appraisal of everything which is happening around and try to justify the price which is happening. There are certain methods which are being provided, and let's try to look at some example of each method that we are dealing with. One method by which price can be justified is comparable uncontrolled price, or what is known as a cup method. Let us try to demystify this. take for example that Tata Motors is manufacturing nano cars and it is selling nano cars all over the country. There are Tata companies which come up in the queue and they say, by way of perquisite, we would like to provide nano cars to our employees. We are here to purchase the cars. Now, what is the price at which cars are offered to these entities is something which will need to be benchmarked. The purchaser has to show to the officer that the price which I am paying is the correct price and I am not paying a higher price because there is an associate concern. If I am paying lower price, question doesn't arise. Now let's assume that Tata Motors is able to say that we have our own internal cups available, that 80% of our sale is at the same price, then what more do you require? That is an internal cup with reference to which you will be able to justify the correctness of the price. When all your sales of standard goods are, say, in favor of your own subsidiary, say there is a call center which is operating, say for example Axis Bank, it has got, let's assume hypothetically, a particular subsidiary which is in a call center activity and the requirement of the bank is so huge that all the services are purchased for the time being only by the parent company. This is a 48-2 transaction. Now what will Axis Bank, the parent company, have to bring on table? They will bring in the quotation or the transactions of the other call centers and they would come up and say that if I had gone to any other call center in order to enjoy the same service, then on a per person basis or a per job basis or per time basis or whatever, I would have had to make this much payment to another. So if uncontrolled people have been paying the same price, there is nothing wrong in my making the same payment to my own subsidiary. Now this will be a case of an external cup. And I am sure over the seminar we will get some insight into how the documents are to be prepared, what are the statistics which are available in public domain, the software which are available, what I can rely upon in order to find out which are the comparable entities offering similar services and what is the rate which is being charged by the other entities. Now let's take the second method. The second method is the resale price method. Let's take once again Tata Motors. Tata Motors, let's assume, is having one manufacturing unit and hypothetically let's assume it's a tax holiday unit. All the sales of Tata Motors are diverted through a distributor and the distributor gets a discount of say 25% and thereafter there are sales which are made to the third parties. Now here both the parties are under pressure to justify the pricing. Tata Motors has to justify in order to prove that it's earning ordinary profit and is not earning more than ordinary profit, so that tax holiday is not disturbed. Distributor has to make a payment, he has to claim an expenditure, so he needs to justify that price paid is a proper price. How will the two of them justify? And one of the manner in which Tata Motors for its tax holiday may be justified could be that if the group is able to justify the reasonableness of the margin which is earned by the distributor, then automatically probably the tax holiday reasonableness will stand justified. Now this is what in transfer pricing is often considered to be a tested party concept. Except for that one element of a related party sale, all other transactions of Tata Motors are to be considered as third party transaction, and nothing wrong if Tata Motors is earning high profit because of the worth of its product or IPR. If the price of distributor is justified, and the distributor will try to justify the price by saying that, look at all other distributors who are either in the vehicle industry or in a comparable industry doing the same distribution work which I am doing. If you refer to the profit margin of those distributors and compare them with my margin, if I am reporting as much percentage of income as they do, why should you say that price paid is unreasonable? So how best one would put it up is another method. Take for example a cost plus method, and take a pharma industry. In pharma industry we might have a toll manufacturer or a contract manufacturer. IPR and valuables will belong to the parent company, and there is an affiliate which does the dirty work, which is more in the nature of employing labor and ensure that there is a separate employer, but they don't have to do brainy work. They do something which is routine. They do under the instructions of the parent company. Effectively the risk belongs to the parent company. Here, method which can be adopted for payment which is made to the affiliate would be a cost plus basis. That in addition to the cost which is a regulated cost which is being incurred by the affiliate, what is a fair percentage, 15%, 20%, 25%, which ought to be paid by way of a margin or a top-up to the affiliate. And if you can justify that all those in the pharma industry, including third-party job workers, they get by and large the same margin, then automatically pharma company will be able to justify the margin earned in tax holiday unit as also the expenditure which is incurred in favor of the affiliate which is doing the job work. But the most popular is what is known as the TNMM method. It is difficult always to get public data of what is happening in terms of the resale margin, in terms of the cup method, in terms of cost plus. Some of the data might be not in public domain and the documents may not come in table. In a majority of the cases, or a more than majority, ultimately what boils down to the net profit comparison. That if I am a taxpayer, I go to the public data available on our software, I try to find out all those entities who can be regarded as my competitor, performing the type of functions which I am doing, having the risk which I am having, operating in the same geography if geography is of any relevance, and if I can show to the officer that at the end of the year they are earning 12% rate of return either on capital or 10% on sales, or they are earning 35% on the total operating cost, and that my margin is as comparable to the margin which is being earned by these entities, I will be in a position by reference to TNMM method say that I am earning something which is justifiable, something which is operating in the industry at large. But the disadvantage which you have of the analysis would be that after you find out 20 different competitors and filter those which are akin to yours, you will be required to take an arithmetic average of what is happening in the industry. And it is that arithmetic average which will spoil the whole game or which might work out to be an edge for you. Every individual, after all, is different from the average. A class teacher cannot say that on an average, if the entire class gets 35 marks out of 100, everybody will be promoted. There has to be a distinction. But here on a benchmarking, the challenge which will arise would be that you need to compare you as an individual with an overall average which is available. Care therefore needs to be taken in making proper adjustment. Select the samples which are very close to you. Find out the factors which are relevant only to you but not to him, or relevant to him and not to you. Exclude all those people and say that you really can't compare me with them. So, for example, if we were to say that every president of the institute is to be compared with Mr. Manoharan, then it would be very challenging on every president. So many will come up and say that, look, from the analysis, exclude Mr. Manoharan and then try to see, have I or have I not performed? Now, that's a challenge which we will be required to do. Probably the last thing of work which I may touch is that apart from the dogmatic methods, for the purpose of justification, we now also have an unspecified method. You are permitted that if you can establish reasonableness with reference to some other objective evidence, some other subjective evidence as well, with reference not only to concluded transaction, but also a potential negotiation, inquiries or the like, then this rule provides a scope for you to justify your pricing or values. In case of certain unique transaction, this might become handy. Take for example, that you are wanting to purchase a certain IPR, and a patented IPR is something, a class of its own. There is likely to be no parallel available to such a transaction. So how do I benchmark? I might be able to say that I am a subsidiary making a payment, but look at the quotations which were floated, and there were many other players in the same industry willing to pay a price at which I am paying. I am a producer of a movie and I want to negotiate with a sister concern. I would say that if not you as a distributor, there are others who are willing to pay the price, and this can also be regarded as an evidence. Some of the diamonds it may not be possible for you to benchmark, and these exclusive items of paintings can also come up here. In case in a business model that you are paying, it becomes necessary for you to deal with your counterpart or an associate. The documentation, I am sure over a period it will become routine, but my only suggestion is that every year please do pay attention whether there has been any change in the facts or not, because otherwise we as professionals can as well be in trouble. What is happening at the assessment level, I think that's quite time away, and we may therefore with this time only say that we will have tremendous litigation. DRP route is available, APA route is not available, safe harbor route is likely to be not available, and with the litigation which is growing, we do not know which harbor to go to. I will only mention what the President might endorse, that in the course of what we have dealt today, there are controversies thrown up, but you will be following whatever that has been said at your own risk. Quite possible that you will end up with the additions to your income. Neither I nor BCA would be responsible for that. Except that we can collectively say and tell your client that after you are faced with litigation, come up, we are here to handle your litigation, and that's your safe harbor. Thank you very much.
May I request a 2-minute patience, please? Can we wait for 2 minutes till you thank the speaker? Not introducing you was intentional, sir, but not honoring you with the memento was unintentional. So we will remedy my lapse now. Nitin, may I request you to you have tried and tested, sir. I don't think we need to check your performance. The presentation will be uploaded on the website very soon, and so will the video recording of this on the web TV. Raman, may I request you to...
Ladies and friends, I'll just take you through 3 quick announcements. The first one is what Pinakin Bhai referred to in his speech, which is about domestic transfer pricing important issues, a full day workshop where you will all have to work hard on this obnoxious provision and understanding it. It will be on a Saturday, unfortunately, where you will have to study this terrible looking monster from 9:30 to 6 p.m. And it's also in South Mumbai at Baibichawan. So if you would like to enroll, it will be addressed by 5 wonderful speakers, and you can go to the website and look for more information. 7th September. The second workshop is on how to conduct tax audit. Since the audit season is in full swing, this is a very important workshop that we carry out each year for especially new chartered accountants as well as anyone involved with tax audit and understand any nuances that you would like to learn. This will be held on 2nd August from 9:30 to 5 p.m. at Naveen Bhai Thakkar Auditorium near Vileparla East, at Vileparla East near the station. And it will be addressed by 4 speakers. It also has a very fine brain trust session where you can send your queries in advance and hopefully the trustees will answer them to your satisfaction. The professional accountants course, which is a 20-session course, has been postponed to November, and the date will be announced. So those who would want to take that up, who have completed their articleship or they are BCom and they want to fine-tune their accounting skills, this is a great course to take, and is jointly done by HR College, which is right next to this auditorium, and Bombay Chartered Accountant Society. Now coming to the present task of vote of thanks. For several years, Pinakin Bhai has addressed this first lecture meeting after the BCA AGM and Foundation Day. And each year he has always been a top opening batsman, and whichever topic he has been given or he has taken through his presentation, he has really exceeded all our expectations, just like you saw today, with his very detailed analysis. And like the President said, he is the second Lord that we propitiate at the beginning of the year. And in this case, it reminds me that he's perhaps, for this year, we can call him the Lord of the Rings. And this SDT seems like a ring that the government has put on the necks of the SSE or even to the feet of the SSEs. And with his insight, I guess he has helped us understand how we can deal and manage with this law that is facing and staring in our face. So I would request all of you to please join your hands and thank you.